Next. Nope. Stop. Can't keep talking.
15 seconds. 15 seconds. Oh my gosh.
I've seen some surreal things around this place, but this is really something.
Can I take cocaine with my spouse?
Vital parts of our government are about to shut down in just a few hours, and the Republicans have called an emergency meeting on cheese.
Happy New Year.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the fourth video on the legislative branch, and the second in a series of videos trying to answer this big question. Is Congress broken? If so, why? And how do we fix it? And if not, why not? So some of the factors that may contribute to dysfunction in Congress include, first, redistricting and gerrymandering, which is something that takes place in the House of Representatives. So in order to understand redistricting, we need to first watch a video.
Political power in Congress is based around population. Bigger states, like California and Texas, are rewarded with more seats than smaller states, like Rhode Island and Delaware. Since our population is constantly changing, people move, have babies, die, the Constitution requires that a census be held every 10 years to count the people of each state. Census numbers are used in the process of reapportionment to determine how many of the 435 congressional seats each state gets. As states grow in population, they get more seats, and they take those seats from states that have grown less quickly. After each reapportionment, every state must alter the boundaries of their congressional districts to account for these changes. This is called redistricting. The United States is the only advanced democracy in the world where politicians directly participate in the districting process.
So as the video points out, the House of Representatives is determined by proportional representation, and that means that the states that have larger populations have more representatives in Congress, and states that have smaller populations have fewer representatives in the House. Population obviously is constantly in flux and changing as people move, and so every 10 years a census is taken, partly to complete this reapportionment process to determine how many seats each state should be given in the House of Representatives. Reapportionment is the process of reallocating the 435 seats that takes place every 10 years after the U.S. Census. Iowa in the 2010 census lost 1 seat because our population did not really grow compared to the national average. So here you see Iowa's population is growing, but it represents a smaller fraction of the total U.S. population growth, which means Iowa ultimately had to give up one of its seats in the House of Representatives. We went from having 5 districts to 4 districts. So these are the anticipated gains or losses in reapportionment following the 2020 census. This is what is expected. Most people expect to see growth in Texas and in the West and then some southern states. Meanwhile, some of the states that are losing seats are primarily those in the Rust Belt. Now, reapportionment over the last 50 years, we see a similar trend, right? Lots of states in this industrial Midwest have been losing seats, and states across the South and out West are increasingly gaining seats. Iowa in 2010 went from having 5 congressional House districts that look like this to having to go to 4 congressional House districts. And so this is part of the redistricting process where district lines have to be redrawn. So redistricting, the process of redrawing legislative district boundaries that takes place every 10 years based upon changes in the population. It seems like a pretty simple process. However, it is incredibly complex. In the United States, it's typically state legislatures who determine these district boundaries, and consequently, not surprising, the party that holds power in each state legislature oftentimes tries to draw the boundary in a way that is most favorable for their political party so that they can maintain power. And as a result, you oftentimes have very strange shaped district. Here you can see Illinois' Congressional District 4, North Carolina's 12th District, and you can see how these boundary lines have been drawn in all sorts of strange and unusual ways in order to ensure that one political party maintains their power. Now, this is not a new concept. This goes all the way back to Elbridge Gerry, who was one of the founders of the country. Gerry did something very similar in Massachusetts, redrawing one of the state house boundaries in order to maintain power for his political party. The term that we use, gerrymandering, it combines the name Elbridge Gerry, his actual name was Gerry, and then the term mandering, because it looks a little bit like a salamander, these districts that sort of snake and slither all over the place. So gerrymandering, drawing boundaries of legislative districts to benefit one party or group and handicap another. Recently, there was a font that was created using shapes of districts that were gerrymandered. So that's kind of a fun font to have in your collection. How would one go about gerrymandering? Let's take a hypothetical state, and it needs to be broken up into 5 separate districts. And 60% of the people in the state support the blue party and 40% support the red party. If the blue party wanted to gerrymander, it's one way they could do it is by creating 5 districts where the blue is most likely to win every single district. So you can see here 5 districts, blue is most likely to win, but certainly that would not be representative of the population in general. Is there any way that red could achieve a majority? The answer is yes. If you packed all of the blue supporters into 2 districts and then spread out the rest of the blue supporters so that the red then becomes the majority, you could conceivably have a situation where, despite being a significant minority, the red party actually holds more seats in Congress. So there's 2 different techniques when you gerrymander. One is called packing, where you draw lines to concentrate as many of the opposing party's voters in one district as possible. You can see here all these red voters are packed, and that's oftentimes how you get those sort of snaky salamander shape districts. The other approach is to crack. So once you've concentrated one party into a district, then you need to take the rest of the people and dilute the power of the opposing party's supporters across the rest of the district. So this is called packing and cracking. So how does gerrymandering lead to problems in Congress? Well, one problem is that you have a higher concentration then of each political party represented in the district, which means that you end up with more partisan seats, meaning the Republican is most likely to win in Republican gerrymandered districts, while Democrats are more likely to win in Democratic-leaning districts, and therefore it leads to that sort of partisanship that we talked about, where there's no real incentive to work together or compromise in Congress. Is there a solution to this? One solution is just to try and draw districts not in the sort of strange salamandery shape, but instead in ways that provide for more competitive races. This actually took place in Iowa. In 2010, there was redistricting, and one of the things that Iowa did was they established a nonpartisan redistricting committee to ultimately come in and draw the district lines, not relying upon politicians themselves. And this actually has been a model that's worked pretty well. And in some cases, some people suggest Iowa is a model for other states. So those are the kind of competitive seats that this solution seeks to achieve. Another problem that you can identify with Congress, this is one that happens in the Senate, is the use of the filibuster. So this video explains how the filibuster is used.
These 100 people are the U.S. Senate. They pass laws. They vote, and when a majority says yes, it passes. But these days, the Senate doesn't do that very often.
The Senate holding 2 votes, both failed.
It's completely dysfunctional.
4 versions of gun control proposals, and all 4 failed.
See, the Senate has this rule. It says before they vote, 60 people have to agree to have the vote. That means just 41 people, a minority, can entirely block a bill. This is called a filibuster. Early on, filibusters were rare. This is a chart of the number of times the Senate has had a vote to break a filibuster in the last 100 years. But in the last 50 years, they started to grow, and now almost every big bill is filibustered. The U.S. Senate is broken, and the filibuster broke it.
The filibuster was dramatized in the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Jimmy Stewart was the actor, standing on the Senate floor, filibustering a bill.
Well, I'm not late. And I'm going to stay right here and fight for this lost cause, even if this room gets filled with lies like these. and the tailors and all their armies come marching into this place, somebody will listen to me.
So that's what happens to you if you are speaking continuously for 24, 30 straight hours without stop, without a break, without food. That's how the filibuster was supposed to function. So filibuster is a tactic used in the Senate to prevent a measure from being brought to a vote. Here's a video of Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, participating in a filibuster regarding the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare.
I intend to speak in support of defunding Obamacare until I am no longer able to stand. Most Americans could not give a flying flip about a bunch of politicians in Washington. Who cares? What the American people care about is their own lives. On a Saturday or Sunday morning when your dad's making pancakes, it is very cool when he can flip them and make them do a flip high in the air and catch them. He also, I will credit my father, he invented, this wasn't for the restaurant, but he did it anyway, he invented green eggs and ham. If you will forgive me, I want to take the opportunity to read 2 bedtime stories to my girls. I do so like green eggs and ham. Thank you, Sam I am. I want to point out just a few words of wisdom from Duck Dynasty. Redneck rule number 1. Most things can be fixed with duct tape, extension cords. I will say, standing here after 14 hours, standing on your own feet, there's sometimes some pain, sometimes some fatigue that is involved. But you know what? There's far more pain involved in rolling over.
The purpose of a filibuster is to essentially attempt to delay or block a vote by extending the debate on the measure. So how the rules of the Senate work is that there is unlimited debate on a bill prior to the vote that is taken. So as long as a senator wants to continue to debate that bill, they can. Once the debate is concluded, then the vote takes place. Now that's very different than how it works in the House. In the House, there are strict time limits for how long each member has to rise in either support or opposition to a bill. But in the Senate, it's different. You can just continue to talk if you want. There is a way to overcome a filibuster, and that's through what's called a cloture motion. So cloture is a vote that requires 60%, a supermajority, to ultimately bring the debate to a close and proceed to a vote. How it used to work is if you wanted to filibuster, you had to actually stand and speak continuously for as long as the filibuster was taking place. That's not what's required anymore. At some point, the senators basically chickened out, and instead, they allow you to just threaten a filibuster. And as a result, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of filibusters that have been taking place. What is the purpose of the filibuster? The filibuster provides a lot of power to the minority in the Senate, because if you can get at least 40 plus senators to agree, you can hold up a vote on any measure that the Senate is considering taking up.
One thing that we could change without a constitutional amendment that would make a difference here would be the elimination of the routine use of the filibuster in the Senate. Because I think that does, in an era in which the parties are more polarized, almost ensure greater gridlock and less clarity in terms of the positions of the parties. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires it. The framers were pretty good about designing a House, a Senate, to assure that a majority didn't just run rampant. The filibuster in this modern age probably just torques it too far in the direction of a majority party not being able to govern effectively and move forward its platform.
So obviously this is easy to say that when you hold the majority. Filibuster is one thing the majority party oftentimes complains about the minority party using in order to prevent legislation from getting passed. So there is a possible solution though here. In terms of eliminating the filibuster, that would give the majority in the Senate more power, because it would prevent that minority group from blocking bills from coming up to a vote. The final issue we could discuss as a potential problem in Congress involves money.
Super PACs, or Super Political Action Committees, are some of the biggest players in American politics. They emerged in 2010 after the controversial Supreme Court ruling Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which gave corporations the same free speech rights as people. Unlike individuals donating to a candidate's campaign who are under stringent monetary limits, Super PACs can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money aimed at electing or defeating candidates, but they can't coordinate directly with the candidates. Proponents say Super PACs are an important freedom for corporations, unions, associations, and individuals to financially support their political views. Opponents argue Super PACs threaten the fundamentals of democracy, allowing a small number of people with a lot of money to have outsized sway over elections. In 2016 and 2018, Super PACs raised almost $2 billion in each election cycle.
One of the real important questions to think about when we think about whether Congress is broken is, what about all the money that is now flowing into congressional campaigns? We've seen a rise over the last 50 years in the number of dollars that are spent on congressional campaigns, both in the House and the Senate. That's especially taken place in the last 10 years since the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Citizens United versus FEC. And in that case, the Supreme Court in 2010 decided that political spending is in fact a form of protected First Amendment speech. Essentially, the money that you are willing to contribute to, for instance, get advertising supporting a political position or political candidate that you support, is protected under the First Amendment. This is in response to a number of restrictions that had been put in place to try and limit campaign contributions. And essentially, the criticism of Citizens United is it now allows corporations and other outside groups like labor unions to donate money to these super PACs, which, as long as they're not technically coordinating with the candidate's campaign, then they can run any sorts of ads that they want to with the unlimited amount of funds. A potential solution is a constitutional amendment, because again, this is a Supreme Court case interpreting the Constitution that would allow for and establish campaign finance restrictions without running afoul of the First Amendment. So the big question you should be able to answer after watching these two videos is Congress broken? If so, why and how do we fix it? If not, why not? As always, thanks for watching.